right. Looks like we have a great group. So want to wait another minute or should we go ahead and get started?
I'm ready. Let's get started. I see we already have a question in our chat box.
Okay, good.
People are eager to get started.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, we don't want to waste people's time. We want to thank you all for joining us for a virtual town hall with DA Boudin. We're excited to do this. Obviously, we all know during these times we can't do the kinds of community events that we're used to having in San Francisco in our neighborhoods and community. And so we're having to adapt and find new ways of making sure we can hear directly from the community and that you can all hear directly from our DA. So we're excited to do this evening. I want to thank everybody that turned in questions ahead of time so that we would make sure that we had plenty of topics to cover. There were a robust amount of questions to get through a lot of those. And then you can also submit questions here live and we'll do our best to get through those as well. I'm Christine Soto DeBerry. I serve as the DA's Chief of Staff, and my role here really is just to moderate and ask your questions so that we can get through as many of them as possible. And I'm pleased to join you all this evening and like to introduce our District Attorney, Chesa Boudin.
Thank you, Christine, both for helping out today and for all of your contributions to the office in my now nearly 8 months in office and over the last decade as well. Thanks also to all of our staff who helped to organize tonight's town hall and all of you for participating. I had an opportunity this afternoon to review the list of people who have RSVP'd for tonight's event. And let me just say it is tremendously humbling. Of course, we have a really large number of people from here in San Francisco, our core constituency, the people who we are most excited to hear from and take questions from. But we also have people tuning in from as far away as South America and Europe. And I know given the time change, what a challenge that must be. So we are really eager to jump in, to answer questions, to engage in a dialogue to the extent that we can do so, given the distance that COVID-19 has created for all of us in our lives and in our ability to interact. Before we jump in and start taking questions, let me just acknowledge a couple of things. First of all, I'm sure we will not be able to get to every question, but we are happy to continue doing these kinds of events in the future. There are a few things I enjoy more than engaging with people who have difficult questions. It's what we do all day internally, and I know that we get really useful feedback and idea generation from these sorts of public conversations as well. Let me also start by acknowledging what I know to be one of my weaknesses, which is that I try to answer questions on occasion in too much detail. And the real problem with that is simply that we do have a time limit, and I want to be respectful of the time limit, and I want to try to get to as many questions as possible. So I will be self-aware, and I'll encourage Christine to nudge me in answering in too much detail because we do have a lot of weaknesses. So thank you all for your support, for your critical questions, and for spending a little bit of your Friday evening with us. With that, Christine, what questions can we jump into?
Yeah, well, we're going to start with something that seems to be top of mind for people. We got a large number of questions about the recent incidents happening in Portland with the troops that President Trump has been sending in. We have a question, at least from both Meg and Alan, asking if President Trump decided to deploy troops here to San Francisco, what plans do you have to protect our public safety and our community from the recent events similar to the detention of protesters and the sweeping away of people in unmarked law enforcement vehicles? And might you take an action similar to what DA Krasner in Philadelphia has indicated he would do should troops come to Philadelphia?
Thank you for the question. I was on a conference call earlier today with a group of elected prosecutors from across the country, including Portland, Seattle, and many other cities that have been threatened in this way by federal troops under this current administration. We had a really productive conversation about what strategies we can employ and about how we can best respond. And luckily, we are not on the list of cities that the Trump administration is targeting at this moment. And we are more than capable of handling any law enforcement needs related to First Amendment protest activity on our own without federal intervention. So to answer the question, we do not want, we do not need, and we will not tolerate the kind of illegal behavior by the federal government that we've seen in Portland on the streets of San Francisco. If in fact it comes to pass that the Trump administration sends troops to our city, we will be ready to respond with all of the tools at our disposal to enforce the law and to protect the First Amendment activity of our residents.
Great. Such an important issue. I really appreciate people raising that because I know it is on many of our minds as we're watching what's happening around the country. This next question, DA, is much more local in focus, coming from Susan, and she's interested in knowing what your office will do to address crimes such as car break-ins, package theft, panhandling, and drug use, issues that are of a concern to her for making the city a safe, livable community.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Susan. You know, this is one of the topics that came up the most last year when I was on the campaign trail. It was really an issue that was front and center for people in virtually every neighborhood in the city. Auto burglaries, as people remember, were a massive problem. Petty theft and other property crimes as well, package theft. So I want to start with an acknowledgement that this is a problem San Francisco has grappled with for years. It is not a new problem. And there are lots of reasons that we can look at to explain and understand why it's been a problem. But I also want to make sure that we are rooting our policy responses and our resource allocations when it comes to public safety, when it comes to responding to crime, in data. It's essential that what we do in our office and in government in general be rooted in data. And so I want to give you a couple statistics, which I'm taking actually from the San Francisco Police Department's own data about crime and crime reporting. This is not my office's data. This is not data about charging. This is about reported crime in San Francisco. Since my first full day in office on January 9th, there has been a decrease in crime in San Francisco across the board by over 18%. But when it comes to the specific categories of crime that Susan mentioned, the petty thefts, the car break-ins, the crimes that are defined by federal statisticians as larceny, theft crimes, we see a decrease of 32.4%. And the decrease is actually substantially higher if you look at the last few months. So if we go to March 16th, when shelter in place was first ordered, the decrease in larceny theft crimes, including auto burglaries, is over 50%. That is a historic, unprecedented decline in these categories of crimes. And I want to be very clear, Susan. I am not standing here taking credit for those changes. I want to be really clear that crime rates and crime trends are influenced by and shaped by factors that no one agency or no one policy can control. And certainly the effect of COVID-19 with making tourism impossible, with shutting down businesses across the city, has played a big role in those numbers. But it's important to look at those numbers and to remember where we are today. When I took office, a high priority for me and for this city was dealing with property crime. As we stand here today, those very property crime rates have fallen by numbers that nobody could have expected, that nobody could have achieved through any policy change or any law enforcement initiative back in January. So I am tremendously happy with the progress this city has made in terms of property crime rates, even as I'm committed to doing more and to working to ensure that the rates stay as low as they are today as we begin to reopen in whatever time frame our public health officials so allow.
Okay, great. This definitely popcorn style here. So the next question, switching topics again, is around sexual assault. There are two questions and I'm going to try to weave them together. Maybe you could answer both. One is from Wendy, and she indicates that one of the issues you ran on was getting rid of any backlog of rape kits and ensuring that those kits are tested quickly and that we no longer have a backlog. And she's interested into knowing the results of that and consequences for victims. And then I'll just add on to that a similar question about the clearance rate for solving sexual assault cases. This questioner indicates in San Francisco is less than 20%, and asking how we can change that structure to deal more effectively with sexual assault, and wondering whether our police department, as it's currently structured, is the best structure for supporting survivors of these crimes.
Great questions, really big, difficult issues. And these are the kinds of cases that are and will continue to be top priority for me and for my office. So I appreciate you raising them. I wish that I had easy or obvious solutions to the problems at the heart of your question. But let me start with what I think is the good news. We do not any longer have a backlog of untested rape kits in San Francisco. And every rape kit that is gathered is being tested if there's evidence to be tested. That is the information that I have. I want to be clear, my office does not do the testing or control the testing. The police department does. But we have continued to put pressure on the police department. I think the public pressure on this issue has been really instrumental. And as far as the information that we have available, there are no untested rape kits out of San Francisco. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the clearance rates do continue to be low. And testing rape kits is one minimal necessary step to increasing those clearance rates. So I want to talk for a minute about why those cases are so difficult and what some of the unique challenges are when it comes to these cases. When we take something like a robbery, for example, or an assault with a deadly weapon where somebody is seriously injured, when we have to present that information to a judge or to a jury, the facts of assault causing serious injury, there are no universe of facts or situations. There's no scenario in which that injury, that assault was consensual. It doesn't happen. It defies logic, it defies reason. When it comes to sex acts, which we know occur all over the world every day, consensually, there's in some ways, built-in extra hurdle that we as prosecutors and as investigators of these cases have to overcome in order to persuade a judge or a jury that what the victim is saying is true. In other words, the defense will never be, in an assault case, in a physical assault causing injury case, oh, it was consensual. But the first line of defense in a sexual assault case will always be, it was consensual. And so we have that extra hurdle to overcome. It's a real challenge. And it's one that I think I appreciate in my current role more than ever before. I have had a large number of individual meetings with survivors of sexual assault where we talk about the challenges their particular case presents. And I accept any meeting from any survivor of any sexual assault who wants to meet with me. And Christine has been with me for many of those meetings. Lawyers working on the case have been with me for many of those meetings. And in many instances, we have had multiple teams of lawyers do independent reviews of cases to try to come up with a way to prosecute cases where we have credible allegations of sexual assault or sexual violence. They are difficult cases to prosecute, but we are committed to continuing to dedicate resources. It is one of the teams in my office that has the lowest caseload. We've increased the number of lawyers. We've added new attorneys, including female attorneys, to that team. And it's something that we will continue to work with the police department on to engage in prevention, in education, and in forward-looking investigative strategies. I do agree with the thrust of the question as well that our current law enforcement approach to these cases is in many ways deficient. And I think much of it starts with finding ways to empower and encourage and support survivors to come forward as soon as they have experienced sexual assault. Sadly, many of the cases that have been brought to our attention were only brought to our attention, were only reported to the police months, or in some cases, years. One case that we were talking about earlier today, in fact, was brought to the police almost 20 years after the incident. And I want to be clear, we believe survivors of sexual assault, but believing them and having evidence that is sufficient to get past a judge or a jury are not always the same thing. And the more we can incentivize and support survivors, the more we can let them know that we have their back and that we want to support them, the easier it will be for people who have been victimized to feel empowered to come forward. The less stigma we have as a society around sexual violence, the easier it will be for people who've been harmed to get our involvement at a stage when we can really make a difference and bring people to justice.
Right. And now I'm going to move over and take a question off of the Q&A here. It's a question from Michael, and he's interested in understanding why we have agreed to work with billionaire Chris Larson to monitor private security cameras.
Thanks for the question. It's a really good question, and I assume that it is based on the recent New York Times article. So I want to be clear about some of the details in that article and our partnership on this particular project as it was framed by the police, by the New York Times. So as I'm sure you're all aware, we do not control what journalists write about us or even when they write stories about us. It's a frustration that anyone who's ever been involved in news reporting, I'm sure, can appreciate and share. It's one of the beauties of our country, freedom of the press, and it's great that we have a vibrant press corps here in San Francisco that covers local issues. But sadly, not everything that is published is always accurate. And this particular New York Times article is a situation where what was written was really significantly out of context. So I want to give a few details. When I took office in January, as you'll recall from, I think, the first or second question I answered, property crime was one of the #1 issues for voters and residents in this city. And I had been invited to go on a tour of community benefit districts, including the Tenderloin, Japantown, Union Square, and others, to see the efforts that they were taking at a local level to enhance public safety and security. That network of cameras, which is part of those community benefit districts, was funded, at least in part, by Chris Larson. So I went on this tour in January. Chris Larson was there on the tour, and I think it was the second or third time that I had met him in person. And there was a reporter from the New York Times there as well. It was an informational tour. It was one in which I learned a tremendous amount about how the private surveillance operation is working in San Francisco and what its interface is with the police department, my office, and the public defender's office, among others. And then I didn't hear anything more about that project, either from Mr. Larson or from the New York Times, until they ran their article 6 or 7 months later. So to be very clear, I like Chris Larson. I respect him. I look forward to working with him and anybody else in the city who is committed to making it a safer place for all of us. But there is not a partnership when it comes to surveillance cameras. That does not exist. And I have no control over private video camera networks, none whatsoever. I haven't incentivized or encouraged them, nor do I have the ability to stop them, even if I wanted to. But I will say that in many instances, they are the only evidence that allows police to solve cases. And we will rely on valid, admissible evidence to prove cases and to investigate cases. We have to do so. And especially as we talk about defunding the police, especially as we talk about cutting back on resources, we need to be open to creative approaches. And I was very interested in January, and I remain interested in learning more about this process. I was reassured, for example, that none of the cameras involved in any of these networks use facial recognition software. And that would, in fact, be prohibited by San Francisco law, a law which I supported. So I appreciate the question. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. I was extremely dissatisfied with how the New York Times portrayed my involvement in that project. And I would encourage you to look closely at the things that were actually attributed to me, because you will not hear anything, you will not see anything, any quotes or any other public statements in which I advance or support citywide video surveillance projects, or any suggestion that I have any control whatsoever over those video surveillance projects.
Okay, great. I hope that was helpful. I want to transition back now, DA, to a question from Heidi. And Heidi is interested in understanding what, whether there are nonviolent offenders in our jail at 850 Bryant, and I assume she'd be interested in generally our jail population. Her concern is obviously around COVID-19, and she indicated that she's recently heard about outbreaks in Santa Rita, and obviously we've all heard about the outbreak in San Quentin, and wondering how we're dealing with that issue here in San Francisco.
Thank you for that question. It has been a central concern of mine and of the office since March. And it's an area where I think we have a tremendous amount to be proud of, but we cannot rest on our laurels on this issue. We have to be vigilant every single day of the ongoing risk of a COVID-19 epidemic within our county jail and in our court system. We see it happening in San Quentin. We see it happening in Santa Rita Jail. We see it happening across the country, and we watch with fear, and that fear motivates us to take action. So to answer the specific question, we have very, very few people in our jail who are there on anything other than serious and violent crimes. There are a small number of people on nonviolent crimes, but those are people in every instance who have been released multiple times with escalating levels of supervision and have been repeatedly rearrested for new crimes. And even in those instances, if and when we can find creative ways to release them that will give them the structured support and supervision necessary to ensure they don't get arrested again, we are still looking for ways to release those individuals. Now, I want to give you a few numbers, and I don't have them in front of me, so I'm doing this from memory. But when I took office, the jail population was in the high 1100s back in January. The average jail count, daily population of San Francisco County Jail, all of the different, jail facilities, County Jail 1, County Jail 2, was in the neighborhood of 1,100 on average in the month of January. It hit a high of somewhere around 1,250 a couple of weeks after I took office. In response to COVID-19, in response to a very clear and public letter from the jail medical director, we took action to reduce the jail population. We received a letter in March from the director of the jail medical services making crystal clear that in order for her and her team to safely manage the risk that COVID presents to the incarcerated population and to everybody who works in the jail. And we're talking about over 800 people who go in and out of the jail for their jobs every day. We had to reduce the jail population from 1,200 to 700 to 800. On April 30th, our efforts yielded concrete results, and the jail population hit a low, a decades low of 696 people. Since then, the jail population has come back up a little bit, and I think as of today, it's approximately 760, but it is still right in the range that the jail medical director had requested of us, and it is well below what I would have anticipated being able to achieve in just 6 months when I was on the campaign trail. I did run my campaign, as you remember, with a commitment to decrease the number of people in our jail, to facilitate closing county jail, number 4, which is the seismically unsafe part of the jail on top of the Hall of Justice that literally last week resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement because of the daily sewage floods that are making it absolutely unsafe for human habitation. And my commitment was that we would reduce the jail enough to close that part of it. And thanks to our efforts, we now have a binding Board of Supervisors resolution mandating that that part of the county jail close by November of this year. So we have made tremendous progress. We continue to be vigilant about the risks. We continue to work closely with all of our justice partners, but especially jail medical, to identify individuals who are incarcerated who are high risk, who are vulnerable medically, and to find alternatives to incarceration wherever possible for those people.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask a question from the chat that reflects some of the earlier questions we got. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer, but this question is from Jerry. He says he understands it's not the DA's office's responsibility to run the police department. And he's in Noe Valley and has difficulty getting police to respond for calls, as do his neighbors. And he's wondering if there's anything that can be done to either increase police response or at least their interactions with the public.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I certainly do not control the police department. I do speak with the police chief and his command staff on a regular basis, and we try to provide feedback. Again, this is a conversation I'm tempted to spend too long on, and I want to be mindful of the number of voices that we have waiting. Last year, there were about 1 million calls for service for the police. And if I'm doing this from memory again, but I think they responded to somewhere in the neighborhood of 14% of those emergency calls. But for perspective, only 5% of the calls for police service last year were for violent crimes in progress. So part of it is, and this is again, I think in the context of the national conversation that folks are having around resource allocation to police departments, I think part of it is a question of what are we asking police to do? I know that other elected officials, including Mayor Breed and Supervisor Shimon Walton, have been talking about something that I supported throughout my campaign last year, which is building up an emergency response team in the city that has mental health training and drug abuse treatment training so that the police are no longer being diverted from real crimes to deal with those kinds of public health crises. I think it would both save the city money, allow us to respond much more effectively to what represent a significant percentage of the emergency calls for service, and in the process, allow police to be much more effective and timely in their response to calls for responses to crimes in progress. So my hope is we can move in that direction. And I think we have a lot of support from other elected officials.
Great. And as a follow-on to that, Anita wants to know, how do you understand the demand to defund the police as it would apply in San Francisco?
Yeah, so let me just expand a little bit. I think there's a big difference that's often misunderstood between the defund sort of movement on the one hand and abolition on the other. Defund, in my understanding of the term, is a concept that simply says we should critically analyze every single area of tax dollar expenditure. I believe it's something we should do every budget cycle for every department. The difference is that for decades, nobody has taken that level of scrutiny to police departments. Public schools, union contracts, homeless shelters, all these other areas of public health expenditures have been cut and analyzed for savings year after year after year across the country. But the US military budget and local police departments, which have been increasingly militarized, have not faced that same level of scrutiny. So my understanding of the defund the police movement is simply demanding that we critically evaluate expenditures in police departments and that we question whether it's possible to find more effective ways to spend the $700 million a year in San Francisco that currently goes to our police budget. And if some reallocation or reinvestment of that money in other places could be more effective at keeping us safe.
This is a question from Thomas. I'm going quickly so we can answer as many as we can. So no buffers. Thomas, who wants to know how you think about fentanyl being such a much more lethal drug when people ingest it, and it's contributed to over 300 overdose deaths in San Francisco. Would you consider different types of enhanced charging for this type of sales of fentanyl?
Very concerned about overdoses, very concerned about the prevalence of dangerous drugs on our streets and the lack of safe injection sites, for example. I think we can prevent those overdoses through a public health approach and through a harm reduction approach. And I was really disappointed to see that the city declined to continue funding our law enforcement assisted diversion program. I think it was a great program to help people with drug dependency get hooked up with case managers and services that can help avoid overdoses in the first place and reduce dependency on drugs. Unfortunately, the city decided not to continue funding that program, and we have not yet been able to set up a safe injection site. But I continue to be invested in these issues and to use a public health and a harm reduction lens to do so.
Right. The question is from Lawrence. And he says that during the curfew, despite assurances from Mayor Breed and Chief Scott that the arrest would only take place when there were other crimes occurring, on the next to the last night of the curfew, DSA protest group was arrested outside of the Hall of Justice, and then a group of youth returning home were arrested in the Mission. He wants to know, how is our office responding to those arrests?
I support San Francisco residents' First Amendment right to protest, to make their voice heard. And of course, that right extends to people who are visiting San Francisco from other places as well. I think there's a very clear difference, and I've tried to be clear about the difference throughout the last several months between the righteous rage that we saw expressed in so many beautiful protest actions, many of which I personally participated in response to the murder of George Floyd, on the one hand, and on the other, the commercial burglary activity, often referred to as looting, and there is a specific California law that criminalizes looting as defined by law. Those are really distinct. Some of the commercial burglary activity occurred at the same time as there was protest activity, but I can tell you from all of the many protests that I participated in, they were peaceful, they were law-abiding, and to the extent there were laws that were broken, it was civil disobedience. And I want to put the emphasis on civil. It was civil disobedience. I support civil disobedience. I have friends and family members and loved ones that have engaged in civil disobedience. And it's a critical part of social change and political process in our country. For that reason, our office developed a policy which explicitly declined to prosecute any criminal cases brought to us that involved civil disobedience or protest activity, and we have not prosecuted any of those cases. We have, on the other hand, prosecuted cases where there was violence or commercial burglary activity that may have happened contemporaneously with protests.
Okay, this question is from Mimi. She would like to know, what are you doing to open investigations into the police who killed innocent people, including Amalcar Perez Lopez and Luis Gongora Paz?
Thank you for that question. Police transparency and accountability continues to be a high priority for me and for the office. The challenges to enforcing the law equally, to holding police accountable when they break the law, continue to be significant challenges, even for me in my office, particularly in the context of COVID-19. So I have managed over the last 6 or 7 months to hire a number of new staff who bring a diversity of perspective and experience, and who are eager to engage in litigation on behalf of the people of San Francisco in these cases. So we have new lawyers with fresh perspective working on many of those cases you mentioned and more. But what we don't have in this moment is a critical investigative tool and a critical litigation tool that would ordinarily be available to us. We do not have the ability to convene a grand jury. Now, I want to be clear. The law requires that most grand jury proceedings be kept secret, at least until they have concluded. But it is not a secret that in San Francisco, since I took office, we have not been able to convene a single grand jury. We were in the process of trying to do that in February. We were close to doing that in February, and then the pandemic took over. And as you can imagine, the challenges of bringing a couple hundred people into a room for purposes of selecting a grand jury are tremendous in this moment. So we are going to sadly be very limited and very delayed in our ability to move forward with any second look that I would take at those cases and with any other action that we would take in those cases until we can get a grand jury convened.
Okay, this question is anonymous, but I'm going to read the whole thing because it's informative. Thank you, DA Boudin, for your work to date. As a survivor, I voted for you based on your plans for creating restorative and transformative justice programs. While neighborhood courts exist for nonviolent misdemeanor cases since 2012, similarly, programs for juvenile delinquency have existed for some time. Grant you received in July 2020 is for young adults being referred to restorative justice. While I understand budget austerity, there seems to be a substantial amount of extra money invested in staffing your misdemeanor unit when instead that money could be utilized for restorative, transformative justice programs that actually heal the harm. What is your plan for expanding those programs over the next few months and year?
Let me start by thanking you for your support and thanking you for being willing to share a bit of your own story in surviving crime with us today. I hope to continue earning your support. I hope to make you proud of having supported me. And I appreciate that you share, as far as I can tell, my view of restorative justice and the transformative role that it can play, not just for individuals like you who survive crime, but also for the people who harmed you and who cause harm in our communities, as well as for the rest of us who are involved in the criminal justice system. I remain today as committed as ever to expanding restorative justice opportunities. We have made progress despite really substantial obstacles caused by COVID-19. I don't want to sit here and make excuses and blame COVID-19. I think we have a lot to be proud of. We have delivered a tremendous amount in a short period of time. But restorative justice is an area where I share your frustration with the pace of progress. I want to do more, and I want to do more faster. My goal and my commitment to the voters of San Francisco, and I'm going to repeat it today, was to offer every victim of every crime the opportunity to participate in restorative justice. And I want to be able to achieve that sooner than later. The grant that we secured, which you referenced, was a critical part of building our capacity, and we are continuing to work on that. I was able to hire a lawyer to focus all of her time on our restorative justice efforts. And this grant money will allow us to do even more with community partners. So I look forward to fulfilling that promise, and I thank you for asking about it. I thank you for holding me accountable to what is a critical part of my vision for transforming our approach to public safety and criminal justice.
DA, the question is from Dale, who wants to know if you could suggest a cahoots type response like they have in other states here in San Francisco.
Thank you for the question, Dale, and thank you for your other participation in other events that we've held as an office. I know you've been at a number of different advisory panels and so on, so thank you for your participation. For folks who aren't familiar, Cahoots is a Eugene, Oregon-based program that does exactly what we were talking about earlier in the defund the police and police response time conversation. The basic idea, and it's something that I've supported since I was on the campaign trail and before, is that when people call 911, they don't only need someone with a hose or someone with a gun. They often need something else. They need a mental health professional, they need a case manager or a social worker who can de-escalate a situation or help someone in crisis find supportive services. Eugene, Oregon has that. It's a program called Cahoots, and the dispatcher from the 911 operations center decides, based on the nature of the call, who to dispatch. And in many cases, the person dispatched 24/7 is a mental health professional. It's a model that we definitely need in San Francisco. It would save us money, it would save us lives. It would be a far more effective way to respond to so many of the challenges that we see on our streets and that make people feel unsafe when they're walking down the street in their neighborhood. So I look forward to working with you, Dale, and with everybody else who's committed to these issues in San Francisco to continue to hold City Hall accountable and make sure that we are funding those kinds of programs.
Okay. This question is from TT. It says, I had my car stolen last week and was shocked at how little was done. Sad face. Is car theft just not a priority, or do you even consider it a criminal act? The police didn't seem to care at all, and one of them told me there was no point in finding them because they wouldn't be prosecuted anyway. Very frustrating, don't you think?
I do think it's very frustrating, and I can only imagine how frustrating it is for you. I want to apologize on behalf of the city that that happened to you. And I also want to acknowledge that it is an area where we have struggled this year. So again, I want to always focus on data. Your car that was stolen is one of far too many. We've had about 3,000 motor vehicle thefts this year, and that's a 28% increase as compared to the same time period last year. So I want to be honest, crime rates are falling. We talked about property crime rates. This is an exception to that trend. And there's a number of reasons for it. People aren't driving their cars as much. They're parked in the same place for longer, but none of that is an excuse. But I want to get to the heart of your question. We prosecute motor vehicle theft every day. And when the police bring us those cases, we file charges in the neighborhood of 80% of the time in that category of case. So for police officers to tell you it is not a priority for my office, or that they're not going to do their job because of their perspective on what we do, is a lie. It's a disservice to the community, and it's outrageous. Now, I know you're not the only person who's heard it, but I want to be very clear. Police officers have a job to do. It's a difficult job. It's at times a dangerous job. I have tremendous respect for the courage that San Francisco police officers have displayed, particularly in the context of COVID-19. But it does not excuse or justify dishonesty or laziness in the face of crimes that are committed against people like you. We cannot prosecute those cases if they don't make arrests, and they will never make arrests if they don't do their job and investigate those cases. So I'm very sorry for what happened to you. It is not a reflection of the priorities or the reality on the ground in my office. And if we are given a viable case, we will file charges, and we will intervene in a way that is designed in every case at ensuring that the arrest is an opportunity for transforming lives away from crime, for making you whole, securing restitution, or whatever else we can do to support you as a crime victim. And I'm sorry for the way you were treated by San Francisco police officers.
Okay. This question is from Jacqueline. She wants to know, does the DA's office have the resources to pursue cases against big employers who may be taking advantage of people during the pandemic? Thinking of companies like Grubhub and Amazon who might be engaged in price gauging and wage theft.
As you may recall, one of my campaign promises was to start a unit that would focus on economic crimes against workers. And I'm proud to say we were able to hire a veteran labor law lawyer, Scott Stillman, who came to our office a few months ago, and within a month of coming to our office to focus on economic crimes against workers, was able to file a precedent-setting lawsuit in which we alleged that a gig economy company, Grubhub, is engaged in systematic violations of labor law, specifically victimizing employees who they misclassify as independent contractors, also victimizing other companies that comply with labor law and appropriately classify their employees and pay the appropriate compensation and insurance and unemployment benefits and so on. And third, victimizing taxpayers in the state of California, because in a moment like the one we've experienced over these last few months, the unemployment insurance funds at the state level have run out of money. And they wouldn't have run out of money if employers like the gig economy companies you've mentioned and like the one we brought suit against were paying in their fair share. So I'm excited that we've begun to do that work, and I know that we have a lot more to do to ensure equal enforcement of law and protection of our most vulnerable workers.
Right. Okay, this question is from, I believe it's pronounced Lee, indicating we've answered the other questions on the board except this one, so I apologize if I missed it. The topic of the San Francisco Police Officers Association is a hot button issue, but is there some way you can address how the unions are a big part of the problem with the culture?
Absolutely. And I want to just correct a misstatement in my last answer before I take that question. The question had referenced Grubhub, and I'm afraid I repeated that. Our lawsuit that we filed is against DoorDash. So I just want to be clear on that. The Attorney General did file a similar lawsuit in partnership with the San Francisco City Attorney and others against Uber and Lyft with similar claims. With regard to the question about police unions, it is a very serious issue. And I want to be clear, I'm pro-labor. I support unions. I encourage unions to advocate zealously on behalf of their members when it comes to salaries and conditions of employment. That's what unions are for. That's part of what makes this country great. And I know that unions all across the country are under attack. Police unions and the San Francisco Police Officers Association do far more than just advocate for their members. They have been consistently opposed to meaningful police reform. I think former ACLU police accountability expert John Crew said it best when he said that police unions are to police reform what the National Rifle Association is to gun control. If we are serious about police reform, and I am, and we are, then we need to recognize the ways in which police unions have consistently been part of the problem, not just with regard to specific policy changes, but also, as the question points out, with regard to culture. It's an area where I've taken decisive action, and I know that we're tight on time, but I want to just highlight a couple of the things that we've done. And I want to also encourage people to stay tuned for new information and developments on our efforts early next week on this front. I have taken a pledge together with 2 other current district attorneys and a former district attorney that we would never accept police union donations directly to our campaigns in the future, that we would never seek endorsements from police unions because we want to cure the conflict of interest that exists between prosecutors and police unions. We've also asked the California Bar Association and the American Bar Association to make that a ethical rule that would have binding effect on all prosecutors. In addition to that, we have also worked on a range of police transparency and accountability measures. I partnered with Supervisor Shimon Walton to author a resolution that would prohibit San Francisco from hiring police officers with a history of misconduct. And we are working on ways to close the loophole that allows officers who are being investigated for serious misconduct to simply quit their job, retire, without allowing the investigation to conclude. I could go on at length about the other steps we've taken, but I want to be mindful of time and get to a few more questions.
This question's from Sherelle. She wants to know, will you consider working directly with the Black Voices and Allies Leadership Committee in order to consider strategy, civic policy on resolving issues with redesigning public safety?
Absolutely. I work with anyone and everyone, even the police union. I sat down for coffee with the president of the Police Officers Association to try to find common ground. So there's absolutely no hesitation on my part to work with anyone and everyone. And I think the more voices we have, the more people we have at the table and generating ideas and helping to move those ideas forward, the better.
Okay, question from Jose. We'd like to know what you have done to implement a wrongful conviction unit as part of your plans to reshape the office.
Looking back at old convictions is an essential part of any modern, forward-looking, progressive prosecutor's office. And we have been moving slowly. I'm going to be honest. We've been moving slowly forward on that promise that I made. And the main reason is this. Wrongful convictions are really problematic for lots of reasons. But what's more problematic in this moment is people dying of COVID in state prison. And the resources that we have to look back at old convictions, including possible wrongful convictions, in this moment, we have been dedicating instead to identifying cases where people, whether they were rightly or wrongfully convicted, have served enough time and are safe to be released. And so we've been using our power under Penal Code Section 1170D. It's a new provision of law that allows district attorneys the power to resentence anyone in state prison who was sent there out of their county. What that means is the 900 or so people in California State Prison today who were sent there at any point in the past from San Francisco are all cases that we have to review. And in some instances, there may be credible claims of innocence, and we care about those claims, and we will investigate those claims. But it is much faster and easier for us to identify that that person may be safe to be released and to go through the process of asking the court to resentence them, and then to get around to looking at their innocence claims once the pandemic has passed. And so that is what we've chosen to do in this moment. We've resentenced over a dozen people. Some of these are folks who have really serious medical conditions, who are tremendously vulnerable. Some of them have served longer in prison than I've been alive. Some of them are cases where we actually have the support of the victims of the case to do so. And we do consult with the victims in every single one of these cases if we're able to find them and contact them. But that is a faster, more efficient way to bring people home from prison who don't need to be there. And once we're done with this pandemic, we will absolutely expand our efforts to look at wrongful convictions.
It's a question from Sean asking, at one point the federal DA launched initiatives to crack down on drug dealing in the Tenderloin. It's been nearly a year since that effort was launched, yet the Tenderloin is still plagued by drug dealing, with many people violating stay-away orders. No question at the end of that, but I think you could infer what it would be.
I'll take it as a prompt. Look, we all know that the war on drugs has been a colossal failure. The efforts that the federal authorities took in the Tenderloin were simply part of the old, tried and failed war on drugs approach. We cannot arrest or jail our way out of a drug addiction crisis in this country. We cannot do it. We have tried for decades. It has destroyed communities. It has bankrupted local governments. It has cost us trillions of dollars. And what do we have to show for it? As your question points out, you walk down the streets in the Tenderloin and guess what? Drugs are available, they're pure, and they're cheap. Now, I take a lot of criticism from folks who say I don't do enough about the drug sales in the Tenderloin. And I hear those criticisms every day, but I want to be, again, let's look at data. I am not a drug warrior. I do not believe that the traditional tools I have or that the traditional approaches that San Francisco police take to this problem will be successful. Nevertheless, 25%, to be more precise, 24% of my general felony team's caseload today are drug sales cases. We have hundreds of drug sale cases that we are prosecuting. I don't think it's particularly productive. I don't think it's particularly useful, but we are working on developing more effective interventions. We have regular meetings with a number of different task forces to address this issue and to come up with more effective and creative responses. But police spend approximately $20,000 per buy-bust arrest. $20,000 for a single arrest. And in some instances, the person they arrest is someone who is addicted to drugs and is selling a pill or a crumb of crack just to support their own habit. It is a horrific use of our resources. It is ineffective, it is inhumane, and it is clearly not working. I don't want to be part of the war on drugs. I don't want 25% of my lawyers' time and my felony team to go to these cases. And I'm committed to finding more effective solutions that actually make an impact on quality of life for all of the residents in the Tenderloin.
Thank you. And then this question is from Royal. Thank you for your work. Do you anticipate backlogs in the courts as time goes on? And what do you anticipate to be the biggest challenges for the DA's office when the shelter in place is eventually lifted?
Huge challenges. Look, there was a New York Times article maybe a month ago about the caseloads and the backlog of cases in New York courts. And this was a couple months ago, and their dockets were already 30% higher than they had been pre-COVID. So it's definitely a challenge, and it's one that I want to give a lot of credit to my team for how we've handled. In this period, we have made tremendous strides. We have gone from an entirely paper process for rebooking cases the police give us and filing cases with the court, an entirely paper process for providing defense attorneys with discovery, an entirely paper process for building our own case files, and we have converted it to electronic. We did that in a very short period of time, and we've also managed to keep caseloads in most of our teams basically flat during this period. And we've done that through a lot of creative hard work by my team and a lot of collaboration with the courts and our other justice partners in the criminal defense bar. We will have backlogs. I know that there are victims who want to see their cases resolved. I know that there are defendants who are accused of crimes who want to have their day in court. And the victims deserve their day in court, and the defendants deserve their day in court. And I wish we could do more to move cases quickly. One of my commitments was to close a very serious backlog, over 1,100 cases that I inherited that were more than 2 years old. Obviously, COVID-19 has made that particular goal impossible for the moment, but we will continue to do whatever we can to make sure the wheels of justice spin more quickly going forward.
Okay, and this question, is there a role for the DA to play in pushing the mayor to follow the legislation requiring our neighbors experiencing homelessness to be moved into hotel rooms?
I supported that legislation. I've had a lot of productive conversations with the hotel council, and I know that many of our hotel owners have been really cooperative in this process. I want to commend them for that. I was disappointed to see the way that the city responded in the early stages of COVID, and that there wasn't a quicker and more humane implementation of the Board of Supervisors resolution. I don't see any criminal nexus or enforcement mechanism for my office. It would be more in the purview of the city attorney and of the Board of Supervisors. But I think that we have made progress, particularly in the Tenderloin, in the last couple of weeks at providing real meaningful shelter to people who were in tents just a few weeks ago. So I think it was too little too late, but we are moving in the right direction.
This question from David. He wants to know, can you talk to us about how you can improve the connection to behavioral health services for clients whose case has a primary mental health or addiction component?
Huge challenge. Look, 75% of the people who are taken into our county jail are either drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. It's a huge challenge. It's a huge driver of criminal behavior. And our county jail has become, tragically, the #1 provider of behavioral health services in the city. It's not humane, it's not getting the results that we want, and it's tremendously expensive. So it's a huge priority for the city in moving towards a more effective response to the folks we see who are unhoused, the folks we see in mental health crisis on our streets, and towards reducing crime. We cannot continue to wait for people with mental health needs to commit a felony before we give them the services and health care that they need. We have a community advisory group that has been working with us on strategizing around this issue. I know that group met earlier this week, and I'm really eager to get guidance and a roadmap for how I can be effective at addressing this issue from the advisory group that consists of people who are directly impacted, people with family members who've been impacted, as well as a wide range of mental health experts and professionals.
And I think the other side of that coin, there's several questions in here about drug sales. I know you spoke to that, but it does seem to be a recurring question. So is there any other intervention that you have as the district attorney besides prosecution for drug-related offenses, particularly sales?
Sure. Look, we've encouraged the police, and we will continue to encourage the police to focus their resources on upstream activity. I was really heartened to see last night that the police made an arrest that involved seizing $50,000 in drug sales profits and large volumes of drugs at a stash house in the East Bay. That kind of law enforcement effort is far more likely to make a difference than the arrests that we see every single day of people who are themselves addicted on the street corners in the Tenderloin. But we need to also recognize that a significant percentage of people selling drugs in San Francisco, perhaps as many as half, are here from Honduras. And many of them have been trafficked from Honduras. And we need to be mindful about the impact our interventions have and about how those interventions can be effective. Some of these young men have been trafficked here under pain of death. Some of them have had family members who have been in Honduras who have been or will be harmed if they don't continue to pay off the traffickers that brought them here. These are not idle threats. I can tell you from a young Honduran man who I personally represented when I was a public defender, who was accused of selling drugs and who was guilty of selling drugs and who eventually pled guilty to what he was accused of. That when he cooperated years before I met him, when he cooperated with federal authorities in a different state, his father in Honduras was killed in retaliation. These are not idle threats, and we do not have the power to protect people in Honduras from these trafficking organizations. Solving the crisis we see in the Tenderloin is not and will never be as simple as making more arrests, prosecuting more cases, sending more people to jail or prison. It will never be an effective deterrent to send someone to prison for a couple of years if they know that their other alternative of cooperation with us or of not paying traffickers will result in their father or their wife or their child getting killed. So we need to think big picture. We need to develop a trafficking court that is focused specifically on identifying and working with trafficking victims and getting them and their loved ones to a place of safety. And that's something that we are working on.
Okay. This question is from Julie, and we are at 6 o'clock. I'm trying to squeeze in as many as I can. Julie wants to know, the Santa Clara DA recently announced he's going to reduce the number of resisting arrest charges due to racial disparities in those charges. My question is, what is your office doing to examine which charges have the widest racial disparities and which charges you can commit to reducing in an effort to reduce racially motivated charging?
We've done a number of things already. One thing is we are particularly aware of the ways in which resisting arrest or assaulting an officer charges are sometimes used to cover up police misconduct and excessive force. Now, I want to be clear. Of course, we have police officers who are themselves assaulted and who do face people who resist arrest. That happens all the time, and we take those cases very seriously, and we prosecute those cases. But we will not be complicit in covering up police misconduct or excessive force. And for far too long, district attorneys across this country have taken police reports that allege resisting arrest or assaulting an officer, and without any more evidence, have prosecuted those cases. Now we have the benefit of body-worn camera footage. We have the benefit of cell phone footage. We have the benefit of independent witnesses. And I have implemented a policy that requires my charging deputies, my assistant district attorneys in charge of our review of new cases, to view body-worn camera footage or other video evidence before filing those kinds of charges, precisely to avoid that kind of complicity in racially biased excessive force or other misconduct. Now, beyond that, the question also addressed other racial disparities. We've implemented a wide range of policies, including a decision that we will not prosecute charges that are contraband-only charges that stem from pretextual traffic stops. We know that in San Francisco, driving while brown or black is a very, very serious problem. That if you are brown or black, you are far more likely to be stopped by police. You are far more likely to be searched, and you are far more likely to be arrested based on that search, even though across the state of California, searches of white motorists are actually more likely to yield contraband. And recognizing those statistics, recognizing that they have not gotten better over the last 2 decades, despite lots of publicity around the problem, including a 2016 Obama Department of Justice report that highlighted this issue, we took the step back in February of saying, we will not be complicit in this kind of racial bias policing. We will not charge cases that stem from pretextual traffic stops. We've done a number of other things that that I think address this issue, but I want to, again, be respectful of time, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. And I think I'll make this the last question because we are over time, and then let you close out, DA. So this question, in order to impactfully and sustainably reduce crime, causes that lead many people to commit crimes need to be addressed. Does the DA's office have the mandate or the capacity to partner with other city agencies in a proactive manner that tackles the root causes of crime, while also reactively addressing acts of criminality in ways that strengthen communities most affected rather than tearing them apart?
It's a great question, and it's really one that gets at the heart of why I ran for office and why I continue to be so humbled at the opportunity that all of you, that the people of San Francisco have given me to try to move our criminal justice system in the right direction, to make it more humane, to make it focus on the things that matter from a standpoint of victims' rights and public safety and rehabilitation, and to return compassion to the process that has become so dehumanized and so bureaucratic in the way that it processes human beings, whether victims or defendants. And we have a long way to go. We are working on creating incentives for our staff. We are working on finding more effective ways to measure our own success as an office and to share those with the public. I don't expect that the goals that I set for myself, the promises that I made to all of you here in San Francisco, are the kinds of goals that can be accomplished overnight. They were ambitious, and I knew that when I made them. They will take time. They'll take, in some instances, more time than we would have hoped or expected because of the crisis that we're all living through right now. But I also want to be clear that every crisis is an opportunity. And in our office, we have worked hard to turn the economic crisis, the public health crisis, and all of the other challenges that we have been dealt in my first 6 or 7 months in office into motivation for creativity, for innovation, and for finding ways to more effectively and efficiently deliver our services to all of you here in San Francisco. We have a long way to go. We have ambitious goals, and we will continue to fight hard to improve public safety through a humanistic approach that recognizes the past, present, and future of every single person whose life is touched by our criminal justice system, that recognizes that we cannot always undo the harm that crime has caused, but we can help to prevent future crime, and we can empower victims to have a voice in the process.
Great. Okay, I know we're well past the 6 o'clock hour, and we committed to people to end at 6 on their Friday evening. I do just want to let people know that while this was our first, it certainly won't be our last. We're excited to have more engagement with the community. The DA has been doing a lot of community events, but we are going to be hosting more as well. And so we would encourage you all and those that you know to join us for future events. We will certainly be in touch and make those broadly available. I did my best to get through as many questions as I could and to clump them together to try and get answers for you all to big themes. But we will endeavor to continue that dialogue with you. And we want to thank you all for taking time out of your evening to be with us and hear directly from DA Boudin. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Christine. Thank you.